A police officer throws a black boy into a garbage can, humiliating and bullying him. But everything changes when he discovers who his father is. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching this from. The summer evening settled over the city like a heavy, warm blanket. The street lights flickered to life, casting a soft yellow glow on the uneven sidewalks. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that made even the softest footsteps sound loud. For 12-year-old Jaden Carter, this was his favorite time of day, a moment when the world seemed to pause, giving him space to think. Jaden walked down the cracked pavement, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a worn copy of Voices of Justice, Civil Rights Movements in America, clutched tightly in his hands. He had just finished another session at the local library, his sanctuary from the noise and chaos of the world outside. The book had captivated him, painting vivid pictures of people who had stood up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. Someday, he whispered to himself, I'll make a difference too. Jaden's aspirations were not just the idle dreams of a child. His father, Edward Carter, was the city's mayor, a man known for his stern demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice. Edward often spoke of the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity, and those lessons had deeply resonated with Jaden. Though his father's position brought privilege, it also brought pressure, a constant expectation to live up to the Carter name. The Carters lived in a neighborhood that straddled two worlds, the affluent, polished downtown where Edward worked, and the struggling suburbs where socioeconomic divides were stark. Their home was modest, deliberately so, a choice Edward and Lauren Carter had made to stay connected to the community they served. As Jaden neared the intersection of Walnut and 3rd, the familiar hum of a police car's engine broke the silence. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the flashing blue lights reflecting off nearby windows. The patrol car rolled to a stop a few feet behind him, and 2 officers stepped out. Jaden's heart sank. He'd been taught to respect authority, but there was something about the way Officer Larry Hudson moved, deliberate, heavy, and with an air of unwarranted confidence that sent a chill down his spine. Hudson was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a reputation in the neighborhood. People whispered his name with a mix of fear and resentment. He was the type of officer who seemed to thrive on intimidation. "Hey, kid," Hudson called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. "What are you doing out here?" Jaden turned slowly, clutching his book tighter. "Just walking home, sir, from the library." Hudson's eyes narrowed as he approached, his partner trailing a step behind him. The second officer, a younger man with a nervous energy, seemed less sure of himself. "Library, huh?" Hudson smirked. "And what's a kid like you doing with a book like that?" He reached out, snatching the book from Jaden's hands before he could react. It's for school," Jaden stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Hudson flipped through the pages, his expression hardening. "School project, huh? Or maybe you're planning something else. Let me see that backpack." Jaden hesitated, glancing at the younger officer, hoping for some semblance of reason. But the man avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably. "I said, let me see the bag," Hudson barked. With trembling hands, Jaden handed over his backpack. Hudson dumped the contents onto the sidewalk. Pencils, a notebook, a water bottle, and a snack bag tumbled out. He kicked at the items with his boot, as if searching for something incriminating. "What's this?" Hudson sneered, holding up Jaden's notebook. "Plans for some kind of revolution?" "No, sir," Jaden replied quickly. "They're just notes for my history class." Hudson's smirk grew more sinister. "You seem awfully nervous for someone who's just coming home from the library. Got something to hide?" Jaden shook his head, fighting back tears. The humiliation was overwhelming. A few passers-by had stopped to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. No one intervened. No one dared. Hudson leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You know what happens to kids who lie to the police? They end up where they belong, in the trash." Jaden froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Hudson gestured to a large, grimy dumpster at the edge of the alleyway. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if hoping someone would step in and stop this. But Hudson was in control, and his authority went unchallenged. "Get in," Hudson ordered, pointing to the dumpster. Jaden's eyes widened. "What? No, I didn't do anything wrong." Hudson grabbed him by the arm, his grip like a vice. "I said, get in, unless you want me to find a reason to take you downtown." The world seemed to blur as Jaden was dragged toward the dumpster. He could hear Hudson laughing, the sound sharp and cruel. The younger officer muttered something, but Hudson cut him off with a glare. With one last shove, Jaden found himself inside the dumpster. The stench was unbearable, a mix of rotting food and decay. His body ached from the rough treatment, and tears stung his eyes as he tried to steady his breathing. Hudson slammed the lid shut, his laughter echoing in the narrow alley. "Let that be a lesson, kid. Stay out of trouble." As the patrol car drove off, Jaden climbed out of the dumpster, his hands shaking. A small group of onlookers had gathered, their phones aimed at the scene. One of them, a young woman with a determined expression, approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Jaden nodded, though he didn't feel okay. "Thank you," he murmured, not even sure what he was thanking her for. "You're brave," she said, holding up her phone. "I got everything on video. This isn't over." Jaden swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. The quiet of the evening had been shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, the sun shone brightly over the city, its golden light failing to penetrate the darkness Jaden felt inside. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his untouched plate of scrambled eggs. His mother, Lauren, moved around the kitchen, stealing worried glances at her son. She noticed the tear in his shirt, the faint bruises on his arm, and the haunted look in his eyes. "Jaden," she said gently, sitting down across from him, "what happened last night?" Jaden flinched at her words. His father, Edward Carter, had already left for the mayor's office, and the absence of his commanding presence made the kitchen feel emptier. Jaden didn't want to speak. He couldn't. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a terrible movie. The officer's cruel smirk, the cold metal of the dumpster, the laughter that followed him even now. "Nothing, Mom," he mumbled, pushing his plate away. Lauren's eyes narrowed. "Nothing doesn't leave bruises. Nothing doesn't make my son come home looking like he's been through a war." Jaden opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of his phone vibrating on the counter interrupted him. He hesitated before reaching for it, knowing what he would see. His hands trembled as he unlocked the screen. There it was, a video of him being forced into the dumpster, shared hundreds of times. The caption read, "Another example of police overreach, boy abused by Officer Hudson." His mother caught sight of the screen and gasped. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice rising. Jaden froze. "Mom, I didn't—" "Who did this to you?" she interrupted, her voice shaking with anger. "Jaden, tell me right now." He looked at her, his eyes filling with tears. "It was the police, Mom. Officer Hudson." Lauren's face went pale, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Then she stood abruptly, grabbing her phone. "Mom, no!" Jaden pleaded. "Don't tell Dad." "He needs to know," she said firmly, already dialing. "This isn't just about you, Jaden. This is about right and wrong." At City Hall, Edward Carter sat at his desk, engrossed in a budget proposal. His phone buzzed insistently, and he frowned as he picked it up. Lauren's name flashed on the screen. "Lauren," he answered, his tone brisk. "I'm in the middle of something." "Edward," she said, her voice tight with anger, "you need to come home, now." He paused, sensing the urgency in her tone. "What's wrong?" "It's Jaden. Something happened last night. Something bad." Edward's heart sank. He closed the file in front of him, grabbed his jacket, and left his office without another word. Back at home, Jaden sat on the couch, his mother pacing the room. The sound of the front door opening made him flinch. Edward entered, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the living room. His eyes immediately went to Jaden, noting the bruises and the slump of his usually confident shoulders. "What happened?" Edward asked, his voice calm but firm. Lauren handed him the phone, the video already queued up. Edward's expression darkened as he watched. When the video ended, he set the phone down with deliberate care. "Who is the officer in the video?" he asked. "Hudson," Jaden whispered. Edward took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. "Officer Larry Hudson?" Jaden nodded. "He said I looked suspicious. He took my bag, and when he didn't find anything, he threw me into the dumpster." Edward's fists clenched at his sides. Hudson. The name was all too familiar. The officer had a history of complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, but none of them had ever led to disciplinary action. Edward had tried to push for reform within the police department, but his efforts had been met with resistance at every turn. "This ends now," Edward said, his voice low but filled with resolve. While the Carters grappled with the aftermath of the incident, the video continued to spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage, and the hashtags #JusticeForJaden and #HoldHudsonAccountable trended nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every second of the footage. Public opinion was divided. Some condemned the officer's actions, while others defended him, claiming the video didn't show the full story. At the police precinct, Hudson sat in the break room, scrolling through the comments on his phone. His jaw tightened as he read the criticism. He tossed the phone onto the table and leaned back in his chair, muttering under his breath. "Don't let it get to you," said his partner, Officer Reynolds, who sat across from him. "People always overreact to these things." Hudson scowled. "It's a witch hunt, that's what it is. They don't know what it's like out there, dealing with punks like that kid. Always looking for trouble." Reynolds hesitated. He had been there last night, had seen the way Hudson treated the boy. It didn't sit right with him, but speaking out against Hudson wasn't an option. Hudson was a rising star in the department, protected by his connections to powerful figures. "Yeah," Reynolds said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sure." Back at City Hall, Edward Carter convened an emergency meeting with his staff. He showed them the video and outlined his plan to address the incident. "This is bigger than my son," he said. "This is about systemic failure. We've had complaints about Officer Hudson for years, and nothing has been done. That ends today." His chief of staff, a sharp-witted woman named Maria Delgado, raised an eyebrow. "Are you prepared for the backlash?" The police union won't take this line down. I don't care, Edward replied. If we don't take a stand now, we're complicit. Maria nodded. Then we start with an independent investigation. No internal reviews, they'll just bury it. Edward agreed, but he knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Hudson wasn't just a rogue officer, he was a symptom of a much larger problem. Taking him down would mean challenging the very foundations of the city's power structures. Meanwhile, Jaden remained at home, struggling to process everything that was happening. His parents were doing their best to protect him, but he couldn't escape the nagging sense of guilt. The video had thrust him into the spotlight, and now he was the face of a movement he hadn't asked to lead. Sitting on his bed, he opened his notebook and began to write. Words flowed onto the page, a mix of fear, anger, and determination. For the first time since the incident, he felt a flicker of hope. If history had taught him anything, it was that change didn't come without struggle. Jaden didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let fear silence him. The morning after Edward Carter's announcement of an independent investigation, the city was alive with tension. News vans camped outside City Hall, journalists clamoring for updates. Protesters gathered on the steps, holding signs that read "Justice for Jaden" and "No more police brutality." Others defended the police, their chants of "Support our officers" echoing through the streets. The air buzzed with a volatile mix of anger, fear, and determination. Inside the Carter household, Jaden sat on the living room couch, his knees pulled to his chest. The TV was tuned to a local news station, where footage of the dumpster incident played on loop. His name was everywhere now, on banners, in hashtags, on the lips of every reporter. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of attention he didn't want. Lauren sat beside him, gently rubbing his back. "You don't have to watch this, honey." Jaden shook his head. "I need to. If people are standing up for me, I have to know what they're saying." Lauren's heart ached for her son. She could see the weight of the situation pressing down on him, stealing pieces of his childhood. At the police precinct, Officer Larry Hudson paced the small office of Captain Howard Greer. His face was flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is a joke," Hudson spat. "They're treating me like a criminal for doing my job." Captain Greer, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, leaned back in his chair. "Larry, you need to calm down. This is serious." "Serious? What's serious is that kid's family dragging my name through the mud. That video doesn't show the whole story." "And what story is that exactly?" Greer's tone was sharp and Hudson froze. "Because all I see is you shoving a kid into a dumpster. You crossed a line." Hudson scowled. "I'm not the problem here. The mayor's using this to score political points." Greer sighed heavily. "Larry, take some time off. Lay low until this blows over." "Time off?" Hudson's voice rose. "I'm not hiding like I did something wrong. They want a fight? I'll give them one." Edward Carter spent the day locked in meetings, preparing for the inevitable backlash from the police union. His chief of staff, Maria Delgado, had been right. This wouldn't be a simple fight. The police department's leadership was already pushing back, accusing him of undermining their authority. "We need to be strategic," Maria said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "This is everything we have on Hudson. Complaints, internal reviews, disciplinary hearings. It's not enough to fire him outright, but it paints a picture." Edward skimmed the file, his jaw tightening. "Why wasn't this dealt with before?" Maria gave him a pointed look. "Because the system protects its own. You know that." Edward nodded grimly. Then we make the system work for us. Get me the media. I want to make a statement." Jaden's day took a darker turn when he decided to check his social media. His notifications were flooded. Messages of support mingled with hateful comments. Strangers called him a liar, accused him of seeking attention, and even threatened him. One message read, "This kid's just another thug playing victim. Someone needs to teach him a real lesson." Jaden's hands shook as he put the phone down. His chest felt tight, and his vision blurred with tears. He hadn't asked for this. He just wanted to go back to being a normal kid. When Lauren found him, curled up on his bed, she hugged him tightly. "We'll get through this," she whispered. "I promise." "But what if we don't?" Jaden's voice was barely audible. "What if they win?" "They won't," she said firmly, "because you're stronger than they are, and we're not alone." Later that evening, as Edward prepared to leave City Hall, Maria stopped him in the hallway. "There's something you need to see," she said, handing him a tablet. On the screen was a leaked email thread between Hudson and several officers. The messages were laced with derogatory language about Jaden and the Carter family. One line stood out. "We'll make sure this kid and his dad regret ever crossing us." Edward's grip on the tablet tightened. "How did this get out?" Maria hesitated. "I have a source in the department. They're risking a lot to get this to us." "Good," Edward said, "because now we have leverage." While the Carters prepared for the next wave of the battle, Hudson met with a small group of officers in the dimly lit back room of a bar. His anger had festered into something darker, a desire for revenge. "They think they can take me down," he growled, slamming his fist on the table. "They don't know who they're dealing with." Reynolds, sitting at the edge of the group, shifted uncomfortably. "Larry, maybe we should just let this play out. The Union will back us." "Back us?" Hudson interrupted. "They'll sacrifice me to save their own skins." "No, we take control. We hit back." "What are you suggesting?" another officer asked, his voice low. Hudson's lips curled into a sinister smile. "We remind them who's in charge." The night ended with a tense silence in the Carter household. Edward sat in his study, poring over documents, while Lauren and Jaden watched the news in the living room. The protests had grown larger, the voices on both sides louder. Jaden turned to his mother. "Do you think this will ever end?" Lauren smiled softly. "It will, but we have to keep fighting." As the clock struck midnight, Edward received a call that would change everything. "Mr. Mayor," Maria's voice crackled through the line, "we've got a problem. Hudson's planning something, and it's not just about saving his job." "What is it?" Edward demanded. "I don't know yet," Maria said, "but whatever it is, it's big." Edward hung up, his mind racing. The storm was no longer building. It had arrived, and it threatened to destroy everything in its path. The sun rose over the city, its light cutting through the heavy fog that clung to the streets like a warning. For the Carter family, the day began with an unsettling sense of urgency. Edward Carter paced the living room, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. Lauren sat nearby, trying to comfort Jaden, who had barely slept. The weight of the past days had turned their home into a battlefield of tension and fear. "Maria, I don't care what it takes," Edward said sharply into the phone. "Find out what Hudson is planning. If he thinks he can intimidate us, he's sorely mistaken." He ended the call, rubbing his temples as he turned to his family. "They're digging in. Hudson's not just trying to save himself. He's trying to send a message." Lauren met his gaze, her expression a mix of worry and resolve. "And what are we going to do about it?" Edward's voice was steady. "We're going to fight." Across town, Officer Hudson was already at work. His meeting the previous night had cemented his resolve, and now he was pulling strings. He made calls to allies in the department, carefully constructing a narrative that painted him as the victim of a smear campaign. "They're out to get us," he told one of his contacts. "If they take me down, they'll come for the rest of you next. We have to stand together." Hudson's words were calculated, designed to stoke fear and solidarity, and it worked. By midday, several officers had publicly voiced their support for him, claiming the video of the dumpster incident was misleading and taken out of context. At the same time, Hudson's allies began a smear campaign against Edward Carter, accusing him of exploiting his position as mayor to protect his son. Anonymous blogs and social media posts appeared, questioning the Carter family's integrity and suggesting Jaden had been acting suspiciously the night of the incident. Back at City Hall, Edward was in the middle of another meeting with Maria and his legal team. The leaked emails from Hudson and his fellow officers had given them leverage, but it wasn't enough to guarantee a win. The police union had rallied behind Hudson, calling for an internal investigation instead of an independent one. "This is a war of perception," Maria said, pointing to the growing number of headlines framing Hudson as a scapegoat. "If we don't control the narrative, we lose." Edward nodded. "Then we go on the offensive. Release the emails. Let the public see the kind of man Hudson is." One of the lawyers hesitated. "That could backfire. If the union frames it as a breach of trust—" "It doesn't matter," Edward interrupted. "This isn't just about my son. It's about every family that's been silenced by this system." Meanwhile, Jaden found himself struggling to cope with the constant media attention. At school, whispers followed him down the hallways. Some of his classmates offered support, but others avoided him, afraid of getting caught up in the controversy. Teachers treated him with an awkward kindness that only made him feel more isolated. During lunch, Jaden sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, his tray untouched. His best friend, Malik, approached hesitantly. "Hey," Malik said, sliding into the seat across from him. "You okay?" Jaden shrugged. "I don't know. Feels like everyone's staring at me." "They probably are," Malik admitted, then quickly added, "but that's because they know you're brave." Jaden snorted. "Brave? I didn't do anything, I just—" He stopped, his throat tightening. "I just wanted to go home." Malik leaned forward, his voice low. "Yeah, but now you're standing up to them. That's brave, man. And you're not alone." Jaden looked at his friend, grateful for the support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. By late afternoon, the situation had escalated further. The video of Hudson's meeting at the bar had been leaked anonymously, showing him making inflammatory comments about Jaden and the Carter family. News outlets ran the footage alongside the emails, painting a damning picture of the officer's character. In response, Hudson doubled down. He appeared on a local news broadcast, flanked by his lawyer and the head of the police union. "This has nothing to do with justice," Hudson said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a coordinated attack on me and my colleagues by a mayor who's using his son as a pawn. The video doesn't show the full story, and I'll be cleared of any wrongdoing." Edward watched the broadcast from his office, his fists clenched. "He's lying," he muttered. Maria nodded. "And people are believing him. We need something bigger to tip the scales." That evening, Lauren sat down with Jaden in his bedroom. He was hunched over his notebook, scribbling furiously. "Hey," she said softly, sitting beside him. "What are you working on?" Jaden hesitated before handing her the notebook. The pages were filled with his thoughts and feelings about what had happened, his fear, his anger, and his determination to fight back. Lauren's eyes filled with tears as she read. "This is powerful, Jaden. People need to hear this." Jaden shook his head. "I'm just a kid. Why would anyone listen to me?" "Because you're not just a kid," Lauren said firmly. "You're a survivor, and your voice matters." That night, Edward received a call from his source inside the department. The information they provided was chilling. Hudson and his allies were planning to file a lawsuit against the city, claiming defamation and unlawful targeting. They also hinted at something more sinister, a possible attempt to intimidate witnesses or even fabricate evidence. "This isn't just about protecting Hudson," the source said. "They're trying to shut this down entirely." Edward hung up, his mind racing. The stakes were higher than ever, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. As the family gathered in the living room to discuss their next steps, Jaden surprised everyone by speaking up. "I want to tell my story," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Edward and Lauren exchanged a glance. "Are you sure?" Edward asked. Jaden nodded. "If I don't, they'll keep twisting the truth. I want people to know what really happened." Lauren hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Edward placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride and determination shining in his eyes. "Then we'll make sure they hear you," he said. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time the Carters felt a glimmer of hope. They would face whatever came next together, armed with the truth and an unshakable resolve to see justice done. The morning sun rose over a city on edge. Protests outside City Hall had swelled overnight, with people on both sides of the issue gathering in growing numbers. Signs demanding justice for Jaden waved next to those that read, "Support our police." The air was thick with tension, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Inside City Hall, Edward Carter prepared for what he knew would be the most difficult day of his career. His office had become a command center, a flurry of activity as his team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout from Hudson's counterattacks. Maria Delgado stood at his desk, flipping through a thick stack of papers. "This is everything we've got," she said. "Emails, the video from the bar, witness statements. It's damning, but it might not be enough to sway public opinion." Edward sighed, rubbing his temples. "What about the lawsuit?" "They're filing today," Maria replied. "Hudson's team is claiming defamation and targeting. They're trying to paint this as a political vendetta." Edward's jaw tightened. "And the threats?" Maria hesitated before answering. "They're escalating. Your source in the department confirmed that Hudson's allies are leaning on witnesses. Some have already backed out." Edward stood, his expression hard. "Then it's time to fight back." Meanwhile, at the Carter household, Jaden sat at the kitchen table with his mother. In front of him was a notepad, its pages filled with the speech he had been working on all night. His hands shook as he reread the words, but he knew this was something he had to do. "Are you sure about this?" Lauren asked gently. Jaden nodded. "If I don't speak up, they'll keep twisting the story. People need to hear the truth." Lauren reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're braver than most adults, Jaden. Your dad and I are so proud of you." The sound of Edward's car pulling into the driveway interrupted them. Moments later, he walked through the door, his face a mix of exhaustion and determination. "We're holding a press conference this afternoon," he announced. Jaden, are you ready?" Jaden swallowed hard. "I think so." Edward knelt in front of his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone. We'll be right there with you." By midday, the press conference was set up on the steps of City Hall. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Edward stepped up to the podium first, his voice steady as he addressed the city. "This isn't just about my son," he began. "This is about accountability, justice, and the kind of city we want to live in. Officer Hudson's actions were not just a betrayal of the badge. He betrayed the trust of every citizen he swore to protect." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he gestured for Jaden to join him. Jaden took a deep breath and stepped forward. The crowd hushed, and all eyes turned to the boy at the center of the storm. His hands gripped the edges of the podium as he began to speak. "My name is Jaden Carter," he said, his voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. "A week ago, I was just a kid walking home from the library. I didn't do anything wrong, but I was treated like a criminal because of the color of my skin." He looked out at the crowd, meeting their gazes one by one. "What happened to me wasn't just about one bad officer. It's about a system that lets people like him abuse their power. That has to change." The crowd erupted into applause mixed with angry shouts from Hudson's supporters. Jaden stood his ground, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. At the precinct, Hudson watched the press conference on a TV in the break room. His face was a mask of rage as Jaden's words echoed in his ears. "They're making me the villain," he muttered. "This is all Carter's doing." Reynolds, sitting nearby, glanced at Hudson nervously. "Maybe it's time to back off, Larry. This is getting out of hand." Hudson rounded on him, his voice low and dangerous. "Back off? That kid and his father are trying to ruin me. I'm not backing off. I'm just getting started." The press conference had its intended effect. By evening, the video of Jaden's speech had gone viral, sparking a wave of support from across the country. Celebrities, activists, and even other mayors weighed in, calling for systemic reforms. But the backlash was equally fierce. Hudson's supporters flooded social media with accusations, claiming Jaden was lying and Edward was using his son as a political pawn. The city seemed more divided than ever. That night, the Carters gathered in their living room, exhausted but hopeful. Edward sat with Lauren on the couch, while Jaden lay on the floor, scrolling through his phone. "You did great today," Lauren said, stroking Jaden's hair. "I'm so proud of you." Jaden smiled faintly. "Thanks, Mom." Edward's phone buzzed, pulling him from the moment. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Maria." He stepped into his office to take the call. Maria's voice was urgent. "Edward, we've got a problem. Hudson's not backing down. My source says he's planning something big, something to discredit you and Jaden." Edward's stomach tightened. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet," Maria admitted, "but it's serious. You need to be careful." Edward hung up, his mind racing. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. Across the city, Hudson sat in the back room of the bar where he and his allies often gathered. A plan was taking shape. A desperate, dangerous gambit to turn the tide in his favor. "They want a war," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Let's give them one." The battle lines were drawn. The Carters had truth on their side, but Hudson was a man with nothing to lose. The city braced itself for the storm to come. The morning dawned heavy with tension, the city caught in the grip of uncertainty. Edward Carter stood by the window of his office staring at the cityscape. The streets below were filled with protesters, their chants a blend of hope and defiance. Today, he knew, would be the defining moment, not just for his family, but for the city's future. Maria Delgado burst into the room, her face a mask of urgency. She held a tablet in her hands, the screen glowing with a new email thread from her source inside the police department. "They're moving," she said, placing the tablet on his desk. "Hudson's planning to release fabricated evidence that claims Jaden was involved in a theft the night of the incident." Edward's hands clenched into fists. They're trying to smear a 12-year-old boy to save their own skins. Unbelievable. "There's more," Maria said. "They're also targeting witnesses, pressuring them to retract their statements. One of them already did." Edward felt a surge of anger. "We can't let them get away with this. Release the documents we have. All of them." Maria hesitated. "That's a nuclear option, Edward. It'll expose not just Hudson, but half the department. It'll blow everything wide open." Edward's voice was firm. "Good. This city needs the truth." At the Carter household, Lauren was preparing Jaden for another day of media attention. His speech at the press conference had made him a national figure, but it had also made him a target. "I'm proud of you, Jaden," she said, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "But I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" he asked. "Stay close to us. No going anywhere alone. Things are dangerous right now." Jaden nodded, sensing the weight of her words. "I will, Mom." Across town, Hudson was meeting with his allies in the dimly lit back room of their usual bar. A stack of papers lay on the table before him, fabricated evidence designed to paint Jaden as a troublemaker. "This is our way out," Hudson said, his voice calm but cold. "We release this, and the narrative shifts. The Carters lose their credibility, and we win." Reynolds, seated at the edge of the table, looked uneasy. "Are we really going to do this, Larry? He's just a kid." Hudson shot him a withering look. "This isn't about him. It's about survival. If you're not with me, get out." Reynolds hesitated but stayed silent. He knew he was in too deep to back out now. The breaking point came that afternoon. The fabricated evidence was leaked to the press, accompanied by a statement from Hudson's lawyer accusing Edward Carter of using his position to shield his son from accountability. News outlets pounced on the story, and social media erupted with heated debates. But Edward was ready. At a hastily called press conference, he stepped up to the podium, flanked by Maria and Jaden. The reporters shouted questions, but Edward silenced them with a raised hand. "I want to address the allegations being made against my son," he began. "These claims are not only false, they are part of a calculated effort to discredit him and distract from the real issue: systemic abuse of power within our police department." He held up a folder. "This is a complete record of Officer Hudson's misconduct. It includes internal complaints, disciplinary actions, and evidence of his attempts to intimidate witnesses. Today, we're releasing all of it to the public." The room erupted in a frenzy as reporters scrambled to get the documents. Edward turned to Jaden, who stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Jaden Carter," he said, his voice steady. "I'm 12 years old, and I've been called a liar, a criminal, and worse. But I know the truth, and I won't let anyone silence me." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The fallout was immediate. The documents exposed not just Hudson, but a network of corruption within the department. Several high-ranking officers resigned within hours, and the police union scrambled to contain the damage. Hudson, however, refused to back down. He appeared on a local news broadcast claiming the documents were doctored and accusing Edward of orchestrating a smear campaign. "They're trying to destroy me because I stood up for what's right," he said, "but I won't let them win." That night, the Carter family gathered in their living room, watching the news coverage. The tide was turning in their favor, but they knew the fight wasn't over. Edward's phone buzzed with a call from Maria. "We've got Hudson," she said. "Your source came through. They recorded him admitting to fabricating evidence." Edward's shoulders sagged with relief. "Send it to the DA. It's over." The next morning, Hudson was arrested, his face plastered across every news channel. The charges against him included misconduct, evidence tampering, and intimidation. The city erupted in celebration, but Edward remained focused. "This isn't just about one bad officer," he said at a press conference. "It's about rebuilding trust and ensuring this never happens again." For Jaden, the ordeal had been transformative. At school, he was no longer just the quiet kid who loved history. He was a symbol of resilience and courage. His classmates treated him with newfound respect, and even teachers looked at him differently. One afternoon, he stood before his history class, holding the same notebook that had carried his thoughts through the chaos. "History isn't just about the past," he said. "It's about learning from it so we can create a better future. And that starts with standing up for what's right." In the weeks that followed, the city began to heal. Reforms were implemented, and Edward worked tirelessly to ensure accountability within the police department. Jaden found solace in writing, his experiences fueling a passion for justice that burned brighter than ever. As the Carter family sat together one evening, enjoying a rare moment of peace, Edward looked at his son with pride. "You've taught me something, Jaden," he said. "Sometimes it's the smallest voices that make the biggest difference." Jaden smiled. "You taught me that first, Dad." The storm had passed, but its lessons would echo for years to come. A reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth has the power to prevail. The days following Officer Hudson's arrest brought a mix of relief and reflection to the Carter family. For weeks, their lives had been consumed by the storm of public attention, legal battles, and relentless media scrutiny. Now, as the dust began to settle, the city itself seemed to breathe easier. Jaden sat in his room, staring at the blank page of his notebook. He'd filled so many pages with his thoughts during the chaos, but now that the storm had passed, words seemed harder to find. He was no longer just a kid caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had become a symbol, a voice for change. Yet that weight was heavy, even for someone as brave as him. A knock at the door broke his train of thought. "Come in," he called. Edward stepped inside, his usual stern expression softened by pride and a hint of exhaustion. "Hey, champ, mind if I sit?" Jaden nodded, setting the notebook aside. "Sure." Edward sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his son with a mixture of admiration and concern. "How are you holding up?" Jaden shrugged. "Better, I guess. But it still feels weird, like everyone's looking at me like I'm supposed to know what to do next." Edward smiled faintly. "That's the thing about being a leader. Sometimes you don't have all the answers, but you still stand up and try. And that's what you've done, Jaden. You've inspired people, not just in this city, but everywhere." Jaden hesitated before speaking. "Do you think it's really over?" Edward sighed. "For us, maybe. For the city, not yet. There's still so much work to do, but this is a start, and you've helped make that happen." Jaden nodded, his father's words sinking in. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of clarity about the path ahead. Across the city, the ripple effects of Hudson's arrest continued to spread. Several high-ranking officers resigned in disgrace, and a special task force was established to root out corruption within the police department. Edward worked tirelessly with the city council to implement reforms, including mandatory body cameras, de-escalation training, and an independent oversight committee for complaints against officers. The community rallied around these changes, organizing town hall meetings and workshops to bridge the divide between citizens and law enforcement. For the first time in years, there was a sense of hope, a belief that things could truly change. On a crisp Saturday morning, the Carter family stood on the steps of City Hall, joined by a crowd of supporters, activists, and local leaders. Edward had called for a public gathering to announce the city's new reforms, and the turnout exceeded all expectations. As Edward addressed the crowd, his voice rang with conviction. This city has faced its share of challenges, but we've proven that when we stand together, we can overcome anything. These reforms are just the beginning. Real change requires all of us to remain vigilant, to hold each other accountable, and to never lose sight of what's right. The crowd erupted into applause, but Edward wasn't done. He turned to Jaden, who stood by his side, and gestured for him to step forward. Jaden hesitated for a moment, then took the microphone. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on the boy who had become the face of a movement. "I'm not a hero," Jaden began, his voice steady but humble. "I'm just a kid who wanted to go home. What happened to me was wrong, but it wasn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of who they are or where they come from. We can't change the past, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "We have to keep fighting for what's right, not just today, but every day, because that's how we make a difference." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jaden felt a warmth he hadn't known in weeks. It wasn't just the applause, it was the realization that his voice mattered, that he had helped spark something bigger than himself. As the event wound down, the Carters walked home together, their steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. Lauren wrapped an arm around Jaden, her pride evident in her smile. "You were incredible up there," she said. Jaden looked up at her. "Thanks, Mom. I just said what I felt." "And that's what makes it so powerful," Edward added. "You spoke from the heart. That's something no one can take away from you." That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Jaden pulled out his notebook once more. This time the words came easily. He wrote about the journey they'd been on, the lessons they'd learned, and the hope he felt for the future. When he finished, he handed the notebook to his parents. "I think I'm ready to share this," he said. Lauren and Edward exchanged a glance, their pride unmistakable. "You've already made a difference, Jaden," Edward said. "But if this is what you want, we'll support you every step of the way." The story of Jaden Carter and his family became a catalyst for change, not just in their city but across the nation. People found courage in his story, drawing inspiration from a boy who refused to be silenced. And while the road ahead was still long and uncertain, one thing was clear. The Carters had proven that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth and justice could shine through. As Jaden looked out his bedroom window that night, the city lights twinkling in the distance, he felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had the strength to face it. Because sometimes the smallest voices spark the biggest changes. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Leave comments. We want to know what you think. Share this video with your friends to make more people aware of this important topic. And don't forget to check out our other videos. There are many more inspiring stories.